Who am I? Seems like a sort of strange question to be asked, doesn't it? It's not a question people often ask about themselves, at least explicitly. We spend plenty of time asking other people who they are. We're often after information like their name or what they do for a living, but we might be caught a little bit off guard if someone came up to us and said, not who are you, but who am I? One thing we would all like to know, but might not want to admit, is what other people think about us. But it's probably not very often that we ask the question directly, who do people say we are? But that seems to be sort of what Jesus is driving at least to start with. His first question for the disciples is, what do people say about who the chosen one is? In response to his question, the disciples tell Jesus what we can assume they have heard other people say about Jesus. They list off other figures of significance to their religious community, John the Baptist, or Elijah, or Jeremiah, or one of the other prophets. Many who have heard him teach seem to be under the impression that in Jesus they are meeting not God incarnate, but a particular man of God reborn. The disciples are echoing the way they have heard others describe Jesus, a bit of a theological he said, she said. Jesus isn't quite satisfied with what the rumor mill has to say about him, so he turns the question directly to his friends. Who do you say that I am? Peter is the one to step up and respond, you are the Messiah, the firstborn of the living God. In Matthew's gospel, it is here that Peter is given a new name. Your name now is Rock. It is here that Jesus tells Peter he will be given the keys to the reign of heaven, although giving the keys to the kingdom to Peter, of all people, seems kind of like giving the car keys to a 16-year-old for the first time. And depending on how you understand the passage, this is the point at which Jesus sets Peter at the head, or establishes him as the root of the ecclesia, the congregation, the church to come. In this passage, we find what many have pointed to as confirmation that it is from Peter that the entirety of the church was founded and has grown. In this passage, we find in Peter's answer to Jesus what is often viewed as one of the most important Christological confessions in the Gospels. But I'm not so concerned with those answers as I am with the question. Who do you say that I am? I am. This is just how the Spirit of God responded when Moses pressed to know to whom he was speaking in a burning bush on a cliffside. I am as I am, the voice of God tells him. I wonder, would the use of that phrase have triggered the memories of the disciples, who had all likely grown up hearing this story from the Torah read aloud in synagogues? I am as I am, God tells Moses, because Moses wants to know what exactly he is supposed to tell those who will ask him why he has any right to demand the freedom of the Hebrew slaves or to lead them out of Egypt. Won't people want to know where Moses' authority comes from? Moses wants to be able to name the authority who has sent him, but what Moses is told with the phrase, I am as I am, is this. God is known not by what God is called, but by what God does. Jesus faces something of the same thing. He is constantly being asked by whose authority he does the things he does, performing miracles and interpreting scripture anew, and welcoming those who are considered outsiders with the society into which he has been born. Who do you think you are to do these things? Everybody wants to know. But Jesus doesn't seem particularly inclined to just tell people anything. Like God with Moses, Jesus has answered questions about who he is with actions rather than with words. After all, what better way for people to know who we are than by what we do? And now he's turning the question around. So many times people have asked Jesus who he is. Now he asks his disciples, who do you say that I am? Yeah. And like when others have asked Jesus to label his identity or the authority behind his action, Jesus isn't explicitly giving out a whole lot of information here. He asks his disciples who he is rather than telling them. This feels sort of like a teacher who doesn't want to just give the students the answer. He wants to see them figure it out. In true teacher form, Jesus wants to see how his friends' minds will work out the answer. My first thought when reading this passage is that a great deal of agency is being given to Jesus' followers when he asks this question. Honestly, the question strikes me as quite empowering. By this point, I would imagine, it has become fairly evident to our friends, the disciples, that Jesus is no ordinary person. They've seen some pretty amazing, inspiring, miraculous stuff in the time they've spent following and learning from this son of Nazareth. They are all, I would expect, becoming aware that they've been swept up in something far bigger than themselves. But this person who must have seemed so much bigger and important than all of them, this Jesus is asking them what they think it all means. Jesus does not go around telling everyone who he is. He even frequently instructs those for whom he performs miracles not to tell anyone about what has happened to them. This particular story, apparently marked by an important confession of Jesus' true identity, concludes with him once again instructing his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Jesus doesn't go around shouting this information for all to hear. So when Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" he isn't asking them to regurgitate something he's been saying over and over and over. Rather than simply being told, they have seen who Jesus is, in what Jesus does, and now they are being asked to tell Jesus what they understand that to be. Who do you say that I am? Peter's response is not what he has been told about Jesus, it is what he has seen of Jesus. Peter says that Jesus is the Messiah not because this is what he has been told, but because this is what he has experienced. And Peter's experience of Jesus as the Messiah, he doesn't just know, he says aloud. Frederick Buechner points out that even in the privacy of their own little community, calling Jesus the Messiah and the firstborn of the living God was a brave statement. It took a lot of guts to say, and Jesus knew it did, Buechner writes. If it was true, it was enough to blow the lid off everything. If it wasn't true, you could get yourself stoned to death as a blasphemer for just thinking it. But Peter said it anyway, and Jesus made up for him the only beatitude he ever made up for a single individual and said, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah," which means Simon, son of John, and seems to have been what Jesus called Peter when he really meant business. We see throughout the Gospels that Peter had a bit of a reputation for speaking first and thinking second, but this time he spoke with his heart and with his soul, and it paid off. Jesus affirms Peter's instinct, even going so far as to call it divinely inspired, and blesses him for it. So many others are trying to pinpoint Jesus within the legacy of someone they already know, Elijah or Jeremiah or John the Baptist, but the disciples have seen, and Peter has spoken, that in Jesus they are experiencing something completely new. Following this confession of Jesus as Messiah is where the author of this gospel places Jesus' renaming of Peter. And on bedrock like this, I will build my community. Jin Kim writes that the testimony which Peter has given of his experience of Jesus as the Messiah is the rock to which Jesus has attached his ecclesia, his community, his church, more than Peter himself. That is how important Peter's confession is. Experiencing and naming Jesus in this way as the Messiah, the firstborn of the living God, is the foundation of all that Peter and the other disciples have been called to do. We're here this week talking about questions of the soul. Questions of the soul seems like an opportunity to talk about the questions we have for God. But in this passage from the Gospel of Matthew, we don't find a question that our soul has for God. Who do you say that I am? That is a question which God has for our souls. When we claim faith in God as our identity, we are asked every day to explain this in our words and in our actions. The world asks us who we are, and in our answer, we are called upon to reflect who and what it is we claim to believe. It is true, as Alice McKenzie writes, that it would be easier for us to treat this passage from the Gospel of Matthew as just another Bible story, for us to be the audience watching this scene unfold. But we simply can't do that. McKenzie goes on to say that Peter's confession about Jesus and Jesus' commission for Peter are both ours as well. We can share in that identity with Peter. We also strive to follow Jesus, and we also fail sometimes, often. But we are also empowered by Jesus to go forward as forgiven people and face the task ahead, whatever that may be. But in the midst of claiming Peter's confession and commission as our own, I think it is absolutely imperative that we not forget the question is ours as well. Jesus' question is also directed to each and every one of us. God is asking, who do you say that I am? And the answer we give means everything to how we live our faith in our world. While who do you say that I am really seems to be the question, it is also important to remember that it was Jesus' second question. We could understand this passage in such a way that the gospel writer blows past what others have said about Jesus to get to Peter's testimony. And while his statement is certainly important, we must not forget that Peter's confession wouldn't mean nearly as much without what comes before. What do people say about who the chosen one is? Jesus wants to know what other people are saying about him, and then asks what the disciples believe about him. He's not satisfied with the way he is being perceived by others, so he asks what his inner circle has perceived. But what were the other people saying again? That he was Elijah, or Jeremiah, or John the Baptist? We know from other stories in the Gospels that John the Baptist had his own disciples, and practitioners of the Jewish faith, including people like Jesus' own followers, would have grown up awaiting the coming to fruition of prophecies from the likes of Elijah and Jeremiah. Those who define their faith based on the teachings of these individuals are seeing those particular individuals in the work of Jesus. And so, that's how they answer the question. So really, how would we answer the question? Who do you say that I am? Jin Kim writes that the history of Christianity attests to how vulnerable we are to complacency as Christians, and how easy it is for us to slip into idolatry by resting on and reifying someone else's confession of Christ. This passage calls us to move beyond our particular political and denominational factions, our various theological emphases, and our respective ethnic loyalties by speaking truthfully to one another in and through our differences about the impact of Jesus Christ in our own lives. It's very easy, when asked to tell someone what we think about God, to point to the words of someone else. I don't know how the rest of you who are in seminary feel, but with one semester to go, I sometimes get the sense that I'm drowning in what others have said about God. Amen. And have sort of lost track of my own response to God's question for our souls. At some point, what other people have to say about who God is and what our faith is will no longer be enough. At some point, the time comes for each of us to stand up and respond to the ways in which we have experienced God, to speak up for ourselves and tell the world who we experience God to be. Who do you say that I am? The Spirit of God, active and at work in this world, is asking each and every one of us that question. And if someone else were asked that first question about us, what do people say about who the chosen one is? Would they know what to say? Would they know who we say the chosen one is? Not which theologian we most like to quote, but what we ourselves believe about the Messiah, the firstborn of the living God. This is not to say that we cannot and should not learn from one another. We were created to go on this journey together. That's why we worship together. That's why we study together. That's why we're here together. That's why just a few verses later, Jesus describes an ecclesia, a church, to be founded on the testimony of Peter. Those with whom we learn are a big part of how we come to know God at work in our world. But our goal in learning from and being encouraged by one another is to be authentic in our own faith, not parrot someone else's. When God asks us, who do you say that I am? God asks all of us, not just the published theologians or the pastors with the largest congregations. We are all empowered to experience God and respond to the call to name who God is. Who do you say that I am? We are each called to respond to the question in our words and in our actions. If Peter's testimony became the rock from which the church would be built, then each and every one of us in our own confessions, as we respond to God's question for our souls, are adding to that foundation. Imagine what the church could look like if we each, in our own experiences, our own words, our own actions, truly testified to that question God asks of us. Who do you say that I am? Thanks be to God for the courage to respond authentically to the reality of God. Amen.